I hope you can all hear me clearly. It is indeed a pleasure and an honor to be invited to present this talk to the Society this morning. I'm really sorry I can't be there in person. Can I have the first slide, please? In this talk, I want to introduce you to the remarkable world of botanic gardens. I will outline their historic roots and the ways in which they have changed over the years, more or less following these 5 phases that I've outlined here. My aim will be to ensure that the next time you visit your local botanic garden, you will see it through a different lens, giving a new perspective on their importance. Next, please. We know that the first botanic gardens of the modern era were created in Europe, mainly associated with universities and particularly linked with teaching medicine, growing, studying, and demonstrating a wide diversity of plant species used for medicinal purposes. This is the Pisa Botanic Garden established in 1543. Next, please. One of the best known gardens which still bears a name associated with its medicinal origins is the Chelsea Physic Garden in London, founded in 1673 by the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries. The garden's primary benefactor was Sir Hans Sloane, the famous physician, naturalist, collector, and founder of the British Museum. It's a beautiful little garden you can visit today. Next, please. Throughout history, plants have been the most important source of medicine for human health. Medicinal use of plants by early European herbalists didn't follow any system based on the chemical constituents of the plants. Instead, they followed a system that came to be formalized in the 17th century as the doctrine of signatures, in which a particular plant shape or color suggested a use for the plant in the treatment of a specific ailment. For example, yellow flowers were used to treat jaundice, a condition characterized by a yellowing of the skin and the eyes. Plants with kidney-shaped leaves were used to treat renal ailments and so on. My slide shows some examples of the ways in which particular plants were interpreted as containing cures for certain ailments for different parts of the body. There was a belief that God had marked each plant with a clue as to their usage and purpose. Such associations were often then the basis for the use of a plant for a particular treatment, some of which proved to be remarkably effective. Displays of plants in the early botanic or physic garden were therefore an ideal way to teach about the doctrine of signatures and plant usage. Next, please. Elsewhere in the world, such as in Greece, Mexico, China, India, and the Arab world, medicinal plant usage led to the development of some very early gardens. These perhaps could be described as botanical gardens. My slide shows modern-day medicinal plant collections at the Botanic Garden in Thiruvananthapuram in South India. Next, please. In China, for example, gardens as early as 420 AD contained collections of cultivated medicinal plants, each one labeled. However, I believe we still know too little about the origin of most of these gardens in various regions to be certain whether we can regard them as botanic gardens or not. In part, it depends on how we define the botanic garden, and more about that later. My slide shows the Margaret Grigg Nanjing Friendship Garden at the Missouri Botanical Garden, which is modeled on the Scholars' Gardens of southern China. Next, please. However, returning to Europe, these early university botanic gardens really did provide the basis for the development of botanic gardens as we know them today. They became a part of the post-Renaissance development of science in Europe, and it is remarkable that many of the earliest such gardens still survive and are cherished historic monuments, important sources of pride for their founding universities and cities. Next, please. The Padua Botanic Garden in Italy, shown in my slide, is the oldest surviving botanic garden, essentially laid out in the form in which it was created in the 16th century. In 1997, it was the first botanic garden to be added to the UNESCO World Heritage List for its outstanding universal value. Next, please. Over the years, university botanic gardens in Europe moved away from their exclusive focus on medicinals and evolved to become gardens for plant discovery, taxonomy, and plant introduction. Today, many of these earliest botanic gardens contain hugely important collections in their herbaria and historic botanical book and manuscript collections. Indeed, botanic garden herbaria worldwide probably include more than 150 million preserved plant specimens. Our own here at the Missouri Botanical Garden in St. Louis has close to 8 million preserved specimens. Next, please. Many botanic gardens expanded their collections and became centers for the study of plant diversity. The focus of their research soon moved away from living collections themselves and concentrated increasingly on taxonomic studies in the herbaria. As a result, very often little research was undertaken using their living collections. And the identification of botanic gardens with taxonomy continues to the present day. Some botanic gardens have combined roles as botanical museums as well as gardens. And this is an image of the Stephen and Peter Sachs Museum at the Missouri Botanical Garden that we've recently restored and reopened in all its 1859 glory. Next, please. Many botanic gardens were developed following a multi-purpose model. Institutions open to the public and with extensive living plant collections, with herbaria, libraries, and major facilities for horticulture, such as a nursery and greenhouses. Many had academic staff undertaking botanical research. Some were associated with learned societies, such as what is now the National Botanic Gardens of Ireland, originally founded in 1795 by the Royal Dublin Society. I was director at the National Botanic Gardens in Dublin until coming to the Missouri Botanical Garden. Next, please. Moving away from Europe, the development of the first early tropical botanic gardens was more motivated by considerations of trade and commerce than by science for its own sake. This was especially true of those that were established by the European colonial powers in their territories in the 18th and 19th centuries. The first tropical botanic garden was the Royal Botanic Gardens in Pamplemousse in Mauritius, the island that was home to the now extinct dodo. This garden was founded in 1735, initially to provide fresh fruit and vegetables for the settlement and for ships calling at the port. And later, many more economically useful plants were added. Next, please. This was also the pattern for most of the botanic gardens created in India, Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, mainly by the British and the Dutch. Many crop plants were introduced by or through these gardens, often associated with European botanic gardens, such as those in Amsterdam and Kew, and included breadfruit, cinchona, cloves, coffee, cocoa, oil palm, and rubber. The emphasis was very much on economic development of these colonies. Several of these gardens were created specifically to act as nurseries or propagation centers for the receipt of material of commercial crops from overseas. Next, please. Notable amongst them were the Royal Botanic Gardens at Peradeniya in Sri Lanka, founded in 1821, and the Singapore Botanic Garden, founded in 1859, into which the first introductions of para rubber were brought. At the Bogor Botanic Garden in Indonesia, founded in 1817, the first oil palm in Southeast Asia was introduced, and that original specimen only passed away quite recently in the Bogor Botanic Garden. But the movement of germplasm by these tropical botanic gardens across the continents were largely responsible for helping to set the major agricultural patterns in the tropics in several parts of the world. And once these patterns were set, many of these tropical botanic gardens declined in importance as their roles in agriculture, forestry, and horticulture were moved to separate institutes or government departments. Nevertheless, many of these gardens retained important or new roles in research and the scientific study of tropical botany. Next, please. One more example, which is one of my favorite little gardens, is the St. Vincent Botanic Garden in the Caribbean, often regarded as the oldest existing botanic garden in the Americas. And this was established by the British in 1759. It was primarily to provide medicinal plants for the military and to improve the life and economy of the colony. There are even breadfruit trees there that are said to be descended from those introduced by Captain William Bligh in 1793 on his voyage from the Pacific. A second expedition following the ill-fated voyage of HMS Bounty in 1789. Next, please. In many temperate regions, a large number of civic or municipal gardens were founded in the 19th and 20th century, often for the primary purpose of displaying displaying plants for their beauty, for horticulture and for public recreation. In the 20th century, such gardens were a particular feature of the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. Next, please. Many of these gardens did not initially develop major scientific facilities or programs. There are notable exceptions to this, however, such as the Missouri Botanical Garden itself. It was founded in 1859 by an Englishman, Henry Shaw, and is one of the oldest botanic gardens in the United States. Next, please. In tropical Africa and in Latin America, with very few exceptions, most botanic gardens are 20th century foundations. In South America, only the Rio de Janeiro Botanic Garden dates from the 19th century. And in Central America, an early botanic garden was founded in Mexico in 1781. Otherwise, all other botanic gardens in Latin America are recent, most of them created in the last 30 to 40 years. A remarkable expansion in gardens in many of those countries, such as in Brazil, which has gone from 3 to today almost 50 botanic gardens. Next, please. This slide shows a breakdown on the dates of the establishment of botanic gardens. While it is remarkable that the majority of the world's botanic gardens were created in the last 50 to 70 years, many of the oldest botanic gardens are still thriving, world-leading gardens. Next. Number of botanic gardens worldwide continues to grow, and it has been noteworthy that many have been created in the last 40 years. Next, please. While the majority of botanic gardens occur in Europe and North America, the numbers of new gardens continues to grow in regions such as in Latin America, East and Southeast Asia, including in China. Next, please. And many of the new botanic gardens are situated in developing countries or regions of high native plant diversity. In the last few decades, there has been a renaissance in botanic gardens worldwide, largely as a result of the rising concern for biodiversity loss and the need for many more institutions to become active in plant conservation, particularly of their own native species. And there's been a corresponding rise in botanic garden involvement in the floras and documenting the plants of their own regions too. Next, please. It is exciting to see new botanic gardens being created in countries where previously there were none. There are very, very few in the Middle East. But one such is the Royal Botanic Garden of Jordan, established in 2005. It is the result of the vision and determination of one individual, Her Royal Highness Princess Basma bint Ali, shown here on my slide at the launch of the Royal Botanic Garden project in the mountains near Amman. Next, please. It's worth considering, though, how we define what is a botanic garden. And certainly our understanding of what is a botanic garden in the modern sense has developed and evolved. I found an old definition from the International Association of Botanic Gardens in 1963, which defined a botanic garden as one which is open to the public and in which the plants are labeled, and which often gets a laugh from modern day audiences, particularly those associated with botanic gardens. Next, please. Perhaps a more recent definition and more useful is one that I coined in 1999 that says that they can be defined as an institution holding documented collections of living plants for the purposes of scientific research, conservation, display, and education. Next, please. What stimulated this remarkable growth in botanic gardens and their community worldwide over the last few decades? The growing environmental crisis globally has certainly been the main driver. Today, of the circa 400,000 plant species known worldwide, between 1/4 and 1/3 are threatened with extinction in the wild. And botanic gardens have responded really well to this crisis and have moved rapidly to bring many endangered species into cultivation and conservation programs in recent years. Today, more than 1/3 of the world's plants are grown in one or more botanic gardens or stored in their seed banks. The image on my slide here is of a palm, showing a rather younger version of me in 1985 trying to collect seed from what is still the last specimen of that particular species left in the world, this Hyophorbe, down to one specimen growing in the Cure Peep Botanic Garden in the center of Mauritius, which is nobody yet has been able to propagate. Next, please. At the same time, botanic gardens have been working through the United Nations to help create a global strategy for plant conservation as a shared action agenda for all of us for plant conservation. Next, please. Botanic gardens also came to realize that we must have a global understanding of the world's plants, where they are, what is their status, and how can they be identified and conserved. And stimulated by the global strategy for plant conservation, in 2012, we began work to prepare the first ever comprehensive Flora of the World online. And about 50 botanic gardens have now come together to lead this work. And you can find information on every known plant species now at the World Flora Online website, worldfloraonline.org. It is well worth exploring. Next, please. And lastly, these are images of just 9 of the 600 new plant species discovered and described by scientists from the Missouri Botanical Garden since 2020. We are playing our part in understanding and protecting the world's plants, a natural resource that sustains us all. And just some of the about 2,000 new plants that are being found around the world each year, most of which are in danger of extinction in the wild. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, and I hope our technology works because I expect there are questions from the audience. Here's one.
Hi, Sean Carroll, biologist. Thanks, a lovely talk. I'm just curious about the role of Botanic Gardens now in sort of containing an unintended consequence of probably all that spread of crops, which are invasive plant species, which are notoriously difficult to uproot once they've established themselves.
Indeed, one of the threats to native plant diversity is recorded as being the spread of invasive pests and diseases, and botanic gardens have played their part in the spread of invasive species. But there is great awareness today that this is a continuing threat. Most botanic gardens now have made sure that any invasive species that they have or had in their collections are now removed and not grown. We have a risk policy here at the Missouri Botanical Garden. So every single species goes through an invasive species risk assessment before we will grow it. I remember in Dublin, we had in cultivation, we had poison ivy growing in the National Botanic Gardens, and it had been there for about 80 years. One year while I was director, it fruited for the first time, and we took the decision to eradicate it from the garden. The last thing we wanted was to spread poison ivy throughout Ireland as a new invasive species.
Let me ask you a question. What is in addition to invasive species, what's the major threat that's causing the extinction? Is it lack of pollinators? I mean, how much of it is connected to the climate crisis itself?
Well, I think generally speaking, what's regarded as the major threat to native plant diversity is the loss of natural habitats. And a big driver, of course, is unsustainable development in so many countries. Loss of natural habitats through invasive, through unsustainable logging, through spread of agriculture. But all driven by the increase in the world population. We are 7 billion people, when in the 1950s there were 2 billion people or thereabouts. And that is a key driver. But overall, you can overlay the threats to plants from so many different sources with the impact of climate change. There are many plant species which are functionally extinct now because they can no longer survive in the climates in which they're found. There are also loss of pollinators due to climate change is another impact. Another impact is the fact that in certain parts of the world there are climate change migrations of people who are trying to escape from drought and poverty, and for example, in Madagascar, some of the important nature reserves are being taken over by people who are in extreme poverty coming in to do slash and burn agriculture. So it is a really complex mixture of so many different factors. And only through addressing not only the direct factors that are impacting plants and their habitats, and the underlying factors which are often economic and socioeconomic and political, can we actually address the loss of biodiversity worldwide, which is a huge challenge for every government and for individuals too. Thankfully, the Convention on Biological Diversity in December adopted a new global biodiversity framework with a whole series of targets that countries are now committed to be achieved by 2030. But it's one thing to commit to targets and actions. It's another thing entirely to actually put in place the programs that will change and reverse that loss of biodiversity. We just have to hope for the best.
And we have a question up in the balcony.
Hi, thank you. First, I have to say how cool it is when you think about Missouri being the home to this fantastic botanical garden and how we have these sort of extraordinary treasures just in unexpected places. But the question I was thinking about, I was talking about the botanicals, is I remember reading some years ago that pharmaceutical companies were beginning to kind of plunder into untouched areas, seeking traditional indigenous medicines and whatnot. What is the interaction, or is there interaction with pharmaceutical companies and big pharma with regards to digging into these botanical gardens to maybe dig out material? And could that be positive, as well as what potential risk there might be in that sort of commercialization within that space?
It's a really, really, really important and interesting question. And pharmaceutical companies throughout the world have done extensive research on using traditional knowledge on the use of plants for medicinal purposes to try to identify new plant species to introduce to modern pharmaceutical medicine. By and large, the number of new drugs that have come from such exploration has been quite low. But still, there have been important discoveries made. But one thing that the Convention on Biological Diversity has done through the United Nations has been to recognize that countries that are home to many of these plant species and have been hosting traditional knowledge that has been really important deserve to receive benefits from any discoveries that are made. And so the access to plant material and biodiversity in general and sharing of benefits derived from the use of plant material has been an important component of any discovery of new drugs and so on, derived from wild plant biodiversity, wild plants and other materials. And botanic gardens have understood that they cannot be a way to go around those regulations and those policies, the UN policies. So, for example, each one of the botanic gardens now worldwide, at least the major ones that are active in doing so, will only provide material subject to material transfer agreements between different botanic gardens provided for conservation purposes. And if a pharmaceutical company wants to come along and get material from another country that's growing in a botanic garden, we regretfully must say that they need to go back to the country of origin and negotiate the terms under which they would gain access. And so we are very, very strict about how we will distribute material for any potential economic purpose, so that we don't do that in a way that is unethical.
Jack has our last question.
Question here.
Jack Liu. Thank you so much for your excellent presentation, very informative. And you mentioned that the human population increase the main cause of the habitat destruction and species extinction and so on and so forth. This is totally correct. Many scientific researchers have indicated that. On the other hand, some people like Elon Musk and think that there is a population crisis. A lot of countries, government are encouraging more population growth. And for example, China now encourage change the one-child policy, now encourage more and more people to have more babies. And what do you think about this global trend? On the one hand, we still face huge human pressure. On the other hand, and a lot of government, a lot of high-profile people are encouraging more, people to be born.
I'm not absolutely sure that I got the full question, but let me try and comment nevertheless. The huge and rapid increase in the world's population has certainly put completely unsustainable pressure on its natural resources and its ability to cope with such a growing human population. I think that we have seen, thankfully, rapid development in world agriculture so that we can produce much more food to feed this human population than would have been ever possible using the early forms of agriculture. But that comes at a cost, a sustainability cost as well. And I think that when we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, which the world adopted in 2015, we realize that we must all align ourselves, governments, individual institutions, and through our own lives on trying to achieve sustainability. I think it's often said that population may stabilize through education and by achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and that is just what we have to hope for. That being said, I get encouraged by the huge development that there is in conservation. When you look at the more than doubling, tripling, quadrupling in the number of botanic gardens, that is a really good news story. And it just shows that we are on the right track to, for example, to safeguard the world's plants. And we have to be optimistic. Nobody gets inspired to do new things because of doom and gloom. They get inspired by positive messages of what we can do and what each one of us can do in our own lives.
Okay, I think it's great to end the program on an optimistic note. So thank you for that, and thank you for the talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.